Go ahead and get started. 10 o'clock. So good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. My name is Lance Salisbury. I work for the Department of Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Planning Program, Lake and Streambed Program here in Sacramento. Today's lecture is a part of the Conservation Lecture Series. You can view the schedule and register for upcoming lectures and watch videos of past lectures on the website listed here on the slide. And then we also have some scheduled lectures coming up on here, and these are some of them. We started to introduce restoration lectures, today being the first one of 4 that'll be happening in 2015, and we'll see how they go, and I'll reach out to other researchers to see if they have interest in providing a lecture. For today's lecture, I asked the audience member to hold all questions until the end, so we have a microphone that can be passed around, and the people listening on the WebEx can hear the questions. For those of you on WebEx, you can type your question into the chat box, and I'll read the questions for the presenter at the end of the lecture. In addition to the Q&A period immediately following today's lecture, we have organized a roundtable discussion for those of you interested in discussing topics that are brought up during today's lecture and just ask more detailed and specific questions. The discussion will be held about 4 blocks south of here, down the street at 1700 9th Street, which is at the corner of Q and 9th on the 3rd floor large conference room. If you'd like to join in the discussion via conference line, on this slide, here's a call-in number and the participant number. You could call in as well. And we will display this slide again at the end of the lecture. So today, we're pleased to have DJ Bondrowski, Aaron Martin, Rocco Fiore presenting a lecture on design validation monitoring in the Klamath Watershed. Three lectures today, and between each one I'll give the professional bio. But today the first discussion's by DJ. DJ is a civil engineer with over 16 years of experience planning, designing, and implementing restoration projects across the United States and overseas. Currently he's a senior civil hydraulic project engineer with the Yurok tribe in Northern California. Prior, DJ was the Bureau Reclamation Implementation Chief for the Trinity River Restoration Program, where he oversaw the planning, design, realty, environmental compliance, and construction of the salmon habitat projects on the Trinity River. Before joining Reclamation, DJ was a watershed engineer at the USDA NRCS in northern Michigan, working on river and wetland restoration projects. He also participated in many international details to Central and South America. Please join me in welcoming DJ.
Thanks, Lance. I also want to say thanks to Margaret for hosting us and for setting this up. I really appreciate it. And then my colleagues Aaron and Rocco are going to be talking after my presentation, and we're kind of tag teaming here, so our presentations will essentially link together and talk about some of the different aspects, mine in terms of more design and engineering applications, Aaron in terms of biological monitoring, and Rocco in terms of geomorphology and in terms of the Klamath tributaries. So just to give you a quick context where we're going to be talking about today, the area is in Northern California. You can see here on the left, focused in on the Trinity, which is the Trinity River is the largest tributary to the Klamath River. Klamath watershed there you can see outlined takes into consideration aspects of Oregon and California, and Rocco's presentation will focus more on the lower end near the estuary. But before I get started, as a kind of a challenge to all of you folks and to us as restoration practitioners, when I first started my career with NRCS back in Michigan, I went out to this farm field. We were going to be designing, and this particular farm field is no exact, I don't have a place for this. I just pulled it off the internet as an example to show you. But But anyways, I went out to this farm field to build a wetland restoration project or design one, and I was out with a technician, and we're walking out there, and he said to me, he says, DJ, well, he stopped, midstream, and I said, Harold, what's wrong? What are you thinking? And he just stopped and turned, and he said, DJ, it was at the beginning of my career that I was at the same place, and I drained this entire wetland so we could farm fence row to fence row. And we're back here breaking the same tiles I put in at the beginning of my career to put back the wetland. And that just sat really, strong with me for all these years, that what are we designing today that we have to be accountable and justify at the end of our careers? And so it's, just has always helped me to kind of realize that everything that we put on paper and we put in the field that has an impact on our landscape. And I just recently was on a tour and was in this park-like setting where kids were swimming and things like that, and near this bridge. And so I was looking there, and I was really saddened to see some of the concerns of loose wood that had cable frayed and was floating in the area where the kids were swimming. And it just again reminded me that sometimes the way we think how things were going to perform on the landscape and in our designs don't always end up that way. And so this is just, again, some concerns that I personally have, but it's just, again, challenging to all of us to think through what are we designing, and how can we may be held accountable for that in the future, and to just think through that a little bit more with more circumspect. So, and I threw this slide up, is that sometimes the no action alternative or to take a step backwards is maybe more important than to just move forward, even though funding has been received, things like that. Sometimes it might be just better to take a step back. So the things I'm going to be talking about today are just a little bit overview of the Trinity River Restoration Program, the design process that we've used and most recently in the Trinity, and some pictures of implementation sequences, and as-built data collection, and design validation monitoring. And so just a little bit about the history of the Trinity. In 1964, the Central Valley project was completed, and the Trinity Dam and Lewiston Dam were installed with 90% of the diversion of the Trinity going through the Sacramento Valley for 40 years. And so you can see in the corner there the population decline of the Chinook, coho, and steelhead salmonid species. And prior to that, even with the historical context, in the mining era, the river was literally turned upside down throughout most of the Trinity, and has really caused issues in terms of how do we restore a river that's not only has two dams on it, but has been manipulated for many eras of mining. This is just showing a dredger mining on the Trinity. And then this is a similar spot where the dredgers had performed their activity, and you can see to the right here, this is all leftover dredger tailings. And that those tailing piles were are actually so high that we're in flood stage right now in Trinity in this picture at 12,000 CFS, and with the most water we can release from Trinity Dam in Lewiston, and that's not even touching the floodplain or interacting with the floodplain. So the 40 miles of the Trinity, which is the main project area, 42 miles, reach scale approach to the Trinity, starts in Lewiston and then ends at the confluence of the North Fork. And I'm going to be, the red or the green polygons are just showing projects that have been completed, part of our Phase 1 program. We're well underway into the Phase 2 program. And one of the sites I'm going to be referencing today is a project at Upper Junction City, near the small town of Junction City in California. So this is just a picture of the Junction City, Upper Junction City area prior to implementation. And then this next slide is that same picture showing the design and implementation features that were installed in 2012. And I'll be focusing primarily on in this area, this design complex on the upper part of the project. Design flow is from the bottom of the screen here to the right bottom to the left top. And then this is a project, or the same project, just an oblique shot showing in flood stage at 4,500. And this is like I said, this area right here, this complex is what I'll be kind of focused on in terms of how we approach the design and how we're approaching some of the validation monitoring. Just wanted to give credit to the other designers. We use a multidisciplinary design approach with multi-agencies and multi-disciplines, and just showing some of the other folks that worked on the Upper Junction City design. One of the things I really want you guys to take away today is just the need to, and we've learned this I think the hard way on the Trinity, is the need to use quantitative goals and objectives and metrics in the design process to inform design, and then use that as a foundation to inform monitoring in the future. And so this slide just is an example of some of the goals and objectives that we have on the Trinity and specific to this design, and then the metrics, the quantitative metrics that we used. And so I think early on in the process we had, we used a lot of just overarching goals, and so we've been challenged in the most recent years to really focus our goals down and to be able to use metrics that are quantifiable, that are tied to those goals and objectives. And so we recently been using a system developed by Peter Wilcock and others. It's a multi-criteria decision analysis tool, MCDA, where it looks at different design alternatives and uses the quantitative metrics to help inform which alternative may be most suited for, say, that project based on your goals and objectives. So this is just a kind of a screenshot of that spreadsheet tool, and showing the different the objectives and then the metrics that we're using there. So this has been really useful, not only as a way to evaluate different alternatives, but a way of communication with our stakeholders to be able to have them be able to see how we're designing these projects and why, and what are we using as criteria in terms of what is a successful design alternative. And so this has been just a really great communication tool, like I said, with the stakeholders. The other thing that's been really focused a lot on is development of very detailed terrain models in terms of our different various alternatives. In prior years, we used a lot of more two-dimensional alternatives, where most recently been using three-dimensional terrain models to evaluate various alternatives, and that way we can use hydrodynamic models, et cetera, to be able to help inform those and use those metrics associated with the 3D perspective. And so this is just showing an example of the design at Upper Junction City. Another shot of the terrain model of the design. And we are using repeat terrain models to look at DTM differencing is what it's called, to be able to assess over time if you have a baseline terrain model at the design, if you have a digital terrain model in the Asbuilt, and then digital terrain models in post-construction or post-flow events, you can be able to look at change detection over time, which is really important. And the other aspect is really engaging with 2D hydrodynamic hydraulic models to be able to help inform where we should be putting features, how they may interact with certain flow rates. And these tools are as common and as easy to use as 1D HEC-RAS models. And so my encouragement is that we embrace the 2D hydraulic models and use them in our design process along with our 1D models. But this just helps more specifically inform where we should be looking at putting features and how they will perform under different hydraulic regimes. So this is an example at the Upper Junction City site of the design, looking at a 450 CFS flow rate, 2700 and 7500. This one particular here on the screen is 450 CFS. And what I wanted to point out is that this split flow here was designed There's a log jam at the upstream end to bifurcate the flow into this to the left channel, and then there's this side channel that specifically is an alcove during most of the year, and at around the 2700 it just starts inundating from the upstream, and I'll explain why. So this is 2700, where the water just starts engaging into this alcove and then forms essentially a side channel and engages this off-channel rearing pond. One of our goals and objectives were for this site is to maintain the stream power within the main stem to continue to scour out the deep pools along this bedrock interface here. But yet we wanted to create as much rearing habitat as possible, which is typically tied to slow, shallow water. And so how do we create this floodplain connectivity and create slow waters habitat, but yet maintain stream power where we want it? And so this was we looked at various combinations of the terrain and the hydraulic model and how they interacted to be able to focus in of how that should be designed. And so this was showing 7,500 CFS when we're in flood stage, where the velocity still in the side channel is still appropriate at around 1 to 2 feet per second, and the main stem, is all the way into the 7 feet per second, which would be way too fast for juvenile rearing. But yet the side channel would still be flowing at an appropriate flow rate. So eco-hydraulic modeling is we've been doing it more and more on the Trinity, and just trying to quantify again our design alternatives compared to existing conditions of how much habitat can we actually create, and using hydraulic model output of depth and velocity primarily to determine where would be most suitable for rearing habitat, and then comparing that to our existing conditions so we can help justify how is one alternative compared to existing conditions, or each alternatives basically rank out to each other. And that can be fed back into that MCDA, multi-criteria decision analysis tool that I mentioned earlier. This is just a oblique shot looking at that split flow. And what I was talking about earlier is this channel is almost like acting as a weir right here, where it only engages at that about 2700 to allow the surface water to flow into this alcove. And there's this pond that's kind of hidden back here. And so what we designed is we wanted to maintain cold water refugia at all hydro periods, but at the same time not allowing surface water to get in there, as I mentioned before, to maintain stream power here in the main stem. So we ended up building a hyporheic channel. So we over-excavated this interface here, put in larger substrates so that there could be a hyporheic cold water connection into this pond, and then back out into this alcove. And there's about and continues to be a good flow hyporheically through this, about 1 CFS, and maintaining the temperature, which was a concern of ours at the beginning. So I'll let Aaron talk a little bit about what they're seeing in terms of biological monitoring in here, but definitely a success story. So this is that pond that essentially goes off channel and disconnected hydraulically from surface water through most of the hydro periods, and then the fish that do get trapped in here during flood stage, they can. This is built fairly deep, about 10 feet deep, and it again has a cold water connection, and they can maintain their habitat throughout the year, and then grow bigger, and then get it back out during when the hydro period comes back up. And then this is just showing a cross section of that split flow here, with the hyporheic connection, groundwater connection to the pond, and then back, and then there's another hyporheic connection back out to the alcove. This is another aspect is really trying to get at sediment transport, geomorphic design modeling during the design process to look at physical response. We, like I said before, we wanted to maintain stream power, and we were concerned about these adult holding pools along the bedrock interface. Our stakeholders were really concerned about. So we wanted to maintain stream power, but yet allow habitat development in the floodplain. And so we used a combination of morphodynamic models to look at what different scenarios or different alternatives to understand if the pools would fill or if they would maintain scour. And so my colleague Dr. Young Lai and Dave Guyman both did morphodynamic modeling at these sites and really helped inform some of the alternatives. And this is just a snapshot of showing the different pools that we were concerned about, as well as some bank erosion that we were predicting would happen. And so these morphodynamic models can do predictive-based step process iterations to look at how it might perform in an evolution perspective. So over time, how might these features evolve? It's really important to inform stakeholders. Now, models aren't perfect, but yet these do give us a snapshot of how they may perform in terms of doing comparisons between alternatives rather than absolute modeling. So this is the large wood structure that was placed at the head of this island to bifurcate the flow, and that's the other thing that we're doing a lot more is utilizing large wood in our design approach. And so this is engineered log jam, and this is just showing a schematic of that structure. We used no cables or bolts, anchors for this large wood jam. Rather we interwove the pieces together, both horizontally, and then use piles for the main structure for stability and prevents for scoured protection. And so this is just showing some of the sequencing of the large wood and the different layers that went into that. This is done by Cardno-Entrex. This is also showing some of the 2D hydraulic modeling that we used at that large wood jam to inform where would be the best place to situate it geographically and to help bifurcate the flow into this left split flow channel. And then what were some of the velocities and flow vectors that would be associated with that. So this just shows a construction sequence of that where we weren't sure if we could put piles in the main stem trinity just because we can't de-water, and so we used a new technique where we used a crane with a diesel hammer to be able to drive those in below grade and still be able to maintain turbidity control and not have to influence. We have a huge recreation component on the Trinity, so we had to maintain boaters to be able to access and recreate down the Trinity. So this is just showing how we started that and then used like I said, a crane with hydraulic hammer to palm those to below scour depth. And it worked really well. The first time we tried it on the Trinity there in 2012, and since used that technique a couple of times. Showing some of the horizontal logs, and then that was the finished product with the island right after it was constructed. And right after this was went online and was constructed, the fish were already utilizing it and holding, and now there was a hole right here in front of the a scour hole in front of the large wood jam at the beginning. But since various flows have hit this, there's probably a 10 feet deep to 12 foot deep scour pool in front of this log jam all the way across the main stem now. And you can see a bunch of lures that are hanging off this thing. Every time you go there's more lures because the fishermen are definitely using this because there's a lot of fish using and holding there, both adult and juvenile. And then this is that same log jam under high flow conditions. And this is just a kind of a quick shout out to let you know that there's a large wood national manual that the Bureau and the Corps of Engineers and many others practitioners around the country have been working on, and it's going to be released at the end of this month. It's going to be published. And so it's not a how-to, but more of a guidelines on when you're designing these large wood projects, what things to consider from various different disciplines in terms of geomorphology, biology, engineering aspects, etc. And you know, one of the most important things, of course, on all these projects to inform our next project is really how we should, you know, how do we link the design back to the monitoring? And Aaron will talk more about this, but this is just, you know, kind of a intro slide here to say that our designs are never static, in terms that as we learn more from our monitoring and our evaluation, that we're going to be better at designing the next site. And so through adaptive management, we have to learn from those pieces. And so this is basically, again, linking that design to validation monitoring. So what we've been challenged with is really taking our design goals and objectives, making them more specific, first of all, instead of just saying create more juvenile rearing, how much more juvenile rearing, and at what velocity or what flow rates, et cetera. And so then linking it back to can we go there on site and monitor for those specific design criteria because that's probably the question I get asked the most when I was at the Bureau, and even today, is are these projects working? And point back to this, we can straight face to say are these projects working or not, instead of saying, well, it's going to take 20 years to know if the fish are using it and how successful it is. Yeah, there's that long term, but there's also the short term, and so we have to be. If we don't have this, we can't link back to be able to design better on our next project. And so the thing that I really promote more than ever is the need for as-built data collection. If we don't have a good foundation in terms of knowledge of what we've built, how can we evaluate in the future of how it's responding and performing, and what's the evolution process that's happening? And so my recommendation is to invest in terms of as-built data collection prior to any flow rates or any flows that hit the project and change it. Because there's one thing about designing it, there's another thing about what you build on the site, and very rarely are they the same. And so this is just a encouragement to do that. What's happening on the Trinity is pre and post habitat mapping. Aaron will talk a lot about this, but this is just a slide showing Upper Junction City and some of the mapping, post-construction as-built mapping for habitat, juvenile rearing habitat that they've been doing, so we can help validate the models that we're using in the design process to say, okay, where we predicted there would be habitat and fish utilization, is there actually that happening? We also do a lot of red surveys for spawning, and so this is just showing some of the locations where they were spawning in recent years. And this side channel in particular that flows at all hydro periods is getting a lot of utilization by the by spawning fish and adult salmon, both the Chinook, steelhead, et cetera. But right as soon as we open this side channel up, there's fish spawning in it, and within a month. In terms of as-built collection, the encouragement there is to invest in both in terms of terrestrial as well as bathymetric quantification, and so we use a combination of airborne LiDAR with boat-based sonar and ground surveys to build post-construction terrain models, so we have that foundation so we can look at over time. If you don't have enough monitoring dollars to look at multiple years in a row, at least get the as-built so you can look at 10 years later, determine how this project has evolved and how it's changing and performing. So, and then just in recent years we've used and just recently in this last flow event, used Sidescan Sonar to be able to map underwater topography, and the tools and today are so robust that we can map at very high detail. And then the other tool that we're using is 3D scanning, Tressel Scanning, and we're specifically using these at large wood elements because you can't really survey these with like a total station or a GPS RTK system, and you can't really do it with a LiDAR. So this tool helps us document where we put the wood and what arrangement and what was the architecture like, so that way we can see evolution over time, and also using the same data to be able to help inform our design process. This is the large wood jam that I showed earlier. This is the scan of that. And then what we're doing is bringing that now into 3D hydraulic models to be able to inform, to look at 3D hydraulics around it and be able to form from where we should be putting these structures even more than a 2D perspective. So for both for as-built documentation as well as the design process, these tools have been really helpful. And I just wanted to kind of end with this. This is the front of the large wood jam there at Upper Junction City that I've been talking about, and this is Aaron snorkeled in here, and this is a quick video showing what he saw. This is a spring Chinook, maybe about 10 to 15 pounds, Aaron. And I've snorkeled under there myself as well, and saw a lot of juvenile utilization in adults over time. But that scour pool is much bigger now across that whole channel. What I really want to is just do a shout out to all our partners on the Trinity. It takes a group effort, multi-agency work is important, and so there's a lot of great folks, a lot of great science that are contributing to a lot of the success on the Trinity, and I want to recognize them. And with that, I'll take some questions before our next speaker. So, we're gonna hold it to the end. Okay, perfect. Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, thank you, DJ. I like the sign that says "No biologists, no biological investigation." So, how's it going? So our next speaker, Aaron Martin, is a habitat restoration biologist with the Yurok tribe. Aaron has worked for the Yurok tribe on the Trinity and Klamath rivers for over 13 years. Prior to working for the Yurok tribe, Aaron worked across the western United States as a part of the nationwide EMAP survey and was also employed by CDFW and Oregon DFW. Since 2007, he has been co-lead on the Trinity River habitat assessment and was instrumental in the development of the current methodologies being employed. He's been a core member of the Trinity River design team since 2008. Aaron has also directed or assisted in the construction of the majority of the large wood features built on the Trinity River by the Trinity River Restoration Program. Please join me in welcoming Aaron.
Thank you, Lance. I'm really excited to be here. I like being able to get out and share the work that we've been doing on the Trinity. And so I've been involved in the design and the large wood stuff, but I'm here to mostly talk today about the monitoring and the habitat evaluation we've been doing on the Trinity. We've been figuring it out for a lot of years and took us a number of years to figure it out, and we've been working hard on it for the last 10 years or so. So DJ did a good background on the Trinity, and I'm just going to highlight the main thing is our goal is to restore the natural salmon production, and it's that 40-mile, 64-kilometer restoration reach. And the flow study identified rearing habitat as the limiting factor, and so the number one goal for all our restoration sites is and the whole program is to increase rearing habitat for juvenile salmonids, and of particular Chinook. The Chinook numbers are the highest that we're trying to reach, and we feel pretty confident that coho are going to receive those benefits as well, and steelhead. And so our strategy, the restoration strategy, is process-based restoration. We've restored some flows. We have more flow than we did for the 40 miles after the dam was in place. We know we have to add some coarse sediment below the dam because it's lacking there. And then our other major tool is the channel rehab sites throughout that 64-kilometer restoration reach. So we know we have to act on it with the bulldozers and our flows. We hope those sites change and evolve. We don't want to build completely static features. We want it to be act like a more natural river, and we have to monitor that evolution and hopefully learn things and feed that back into the adaptive management and keep doing better things. So that's where the habitat assessment comes in. Here's our 40-mile reach. DJ showed this map earlier. We originally had 47 sites proposed, and we started essentially on the ground going at these sites in 2005. The record of decision was signed in 2000. Took a few years to get through litigation and to be able to send down higher flows. And since 2005, we've basically completed a little more than half of the sites that we've been working on, or that we originally outlined. So there's a lot of sites, and that's a lot of change that we're making, and that's where we had to figure out an assessment that is able to come and look at all this and be pretty accurate and be repeatable and help inform the design team and the program. So for our rearing habitat assessment, first we had to define what kind of habitat we were going to go out there and identify. And we're a data-rich environment on the Trinity. We have a lot of habitat suitability criteria and fish use information. So we were able to identify specific depths and velocities that we know are the majority of the juvenile fish use. So we targeted around 80% of the juvenile fish use this kind of habitat, and we identified a specific depth and a specific velocity for two different size classes of Chinook and coho, fry and pre-smolt. And basically our methodology is a map-based approach. We're out on the river, we have GPSs, we have laser rangefinders, and those are integrated together. We have somebody on the bank, usually with a tablet PC, and we have people in the water, and they're measuring, they're searching those specific depths and velocities and or areas with cover independently, and we're taking points, and we're able to use our rangefinder and shoot those points, whether it's 5 feet away or 50 feet away, and then those points are integrated in Bluetooth to our tablet, and they come up, and we're creating points, we're creating lines from that, and then we get polygons, and then we get areas, and that's how we come up with their, it's a map-based approach, moving down the river at a restoration site. We're looking at the river on a systemic level, and are we making change at a 40-mile scale, but we're also focused in at rehab sites, and I'm here just to talk about the rehab site assessment. And I'm not going to try to inundate us all with data. We have a lot of data, and we have quite a few reports that I'd be happy to share with folks, but more about just how we do it, why we do it, and how that feeds back to the design process or to the design team. So this is just kind of an example of the river. This area right here might meet, or say it does meet, our depth and velocity criteria, and we have what we've developed is different kinds or different qualities of habitat. And so in places where we have shallow slow that meets that criteria, and we have cover, places where those two things occur, that becomes our optimal habitat. And there's places where we have shallow slow without cover, we call that suitable habitat. And there's places we have cover, but it's a little too deep or a little too fast to meet that shallow slow criteria, and we also call that a suitable habitat. And when you sum all the different kinds together, our two suitables and our optimal, we get total habitat. So some of the graphs you're going to be seeing and how we report is we talk about optimal habitat, and that's the best of. And then we also talk about total habitat, and that's any suitable or optimal habitats that the fish might use. And when we were developing this, we created the maps, and then we went back out there multiple times, and we snorkeled these different qualities of habitat that we described, and the fish densities totally jive with what we were saying. The optimal habitat has the highest densities of fish, probably 3 times that of a suitable habitat, and areas outside of any of those criteria, we have very, very low densities of Chinook and coho. And for coho, coho was primarily only the optimal habitat. We know they're really tied to cover. So, we have Chinook, and we say they can use the total habitat in any of these combinations, but for coho, it's limited to only our optimal habitat within cover. And we have a publication now that came out last year in Restoration Ecology that details our methods and our validation and the reproducibility aspects of our study, and I can show you that reference at the end or share it with anybody. So here's just an example, and we saw this picture from DJ of our habitat maps after we go. We always do a pre-construction, and then we do an as-built, the post-construction, and this is the post-construction at Upper Junction City. We have different colors of habitat, and in my talk where you see blue, and it'll be easier to see on some other slides, where you see blue, that is the optimal, and where red and green, those are the suitable habitats, and green would be cover only, and it's too deep or it's too fast to meet the shallow slow, and red is open shallow slow habitats. So as I said, we've been doing this for years now, and we've looked at a lot of sites, and we're able to see which sites have created more habitat and which sites haven't performed as well. And when you and to do that, for this graph in particular, we have to normalize the habitat. Each site is a different length, so we look at it as a habitat density, and we say, well, how much habitat can you squeeze in to have a certain length of river? So it's meters squared of habitat per length of river, and that way we can compare these different sites. And some of them really stand out, and then some of them stand out on the other end of the spectrum as well. And the gray line on the graph, that is our systemic average. You know, from our systemic look on the 40-mile scale, the average density is around 6 square meters per length of river per meter of habitat. And so a site like Hawker Flat on the far right, you know, that's a constructed site, and it's not even reaching the average of our system. And that was the first site we built, and the first few sites we built were key to our original philosophies, which were we create feathered edges and we do floodplain lowering, and then we let flows hit it and see if the river changes it. And Hawker Flat was a good learning opportunity because that was the first site we built. We did a lot of lowering, a lot of floodplain lowering, a lot of feathered edges, and then immediately after that winter we had 25,000 CFS hit it because it's down in the lower river, so we had tributary accretion going on. And after the flows came down and we went back and looked at it, we're like, wow, it didn't really change a lot. And still to this day, it's very close to the same edge as when the bulldozers left in 2005. And we can see the habitat densities are really low. And so then we can see some of these other sites. The one on the far left is called Sven Overtson, and we have Sawmill and Loudon Meadows. And we're like, all right, well, these ones are really high. What's going on at these sites, and what are we seeing? And in a lot of cases with rearing habitat, we quickly learned that rearing habitat is tied to edge, and the more edge we can squeeze into a length of river, the more habitat we can get. And that shows up here at a Loudon Meadows example. Here's the site prior to construction. It's got our typical Trinity. We have kind of heavy berms on both sides. The river's not going anywhere. And then post-construction, you can see it, and you can see the maps our habitat maps overlaid on it, and you can see this whole side channel complex here on the bottom center. The river's flowing from the bottom right corner to the top left here. And if you were to do a cross section across, say, the valley right here, you might run into like 8 different edges, and that really helps explain the high habitat density we have in places like Loudon. And the other big learning curve we had in those early years, in 2005, there was no wood. We used no wood at all in the construction of that site. In fact, all the wood had to be masticated and spread out as slash and just ground cover. And quickly in the room with us, who worked in the program back then, was John Klochak, and he was one of the really important people that helped us understand how important wood is as a design and restoration tool. And we started off with single logs because it was hard to kind of rock the boat, and DJ showed you the evolution of where we're at now, building really large engineered log jams and having a lot more effect. And it certainly has become for us a realization that it is one of a tool. Like the most complex places we have in the Trinity are mostly associated with bedrock, and well, here's another tool we have to increase like complexity on the river, you know, and that's building wood jams. So since we've been building these sites, our sites have been really evolving. And when we did our validation for the mapping, we basically had main stem and side channels. And now we have a lot of, we have these hypereic side channels, there's hypereic alcoves and disconnected ponds and all these different features that we really didn't evaluate back then. And so we're just working on an evaluation or on a way to evaluate the fish response in some of these different features. And we did a quick pilot study last year, and we're hoping to get more into it in the future. And where we used our habitat maps, one thing we've always been scared about doing pre and post fish utilization at restoration sites, because eventually or at a restoration site you bulldoze all the vegetation away, and it takes a lot of years for that to come back. So Well, we just got rid of them on the cover in a lot of places, and you have to be really careful about talking about fish numbers year to year, which go up and down no matter what's happening on the river. But now we're starting to think a little smarter about it, and it's like, well, if we look in similar kinds of habitats in these different kinds of features, we can compare those densities. Well, let's look in optimal habitat, and what would be called optimal by our criteria in an alcove. Let's look at optimal in the side channel and optimal in the main stem, and see how those densities are comparison, and so we can see which elements are most heavily used. So we're kind of diving into that, the design features, specific features, and because right now our maps assume fish use them all equally, and so last year our crew developed a sampling strategy, and it's just a pilot study where they looked at the different qualities of habitat, and they could distribute a sampling effect within those different kinds. And so these are these little French fries, as DJ called them in here. Those are like the little specific areas that we went and counted fish and got densities and different qualities of habitat. And our fry study, it utilizes 2 divers, and that helps with they're both counting the same fish, and that helps with the variation and understanding how many fish we're counting and how many we're missing, and really improves the statistics. So this is just an example of 2 rehab sites, and you can zoom into these different kinds of alcoves and different side channels or ponds, and then look at those fish densities within them. And if, the data is really not too important, but this is just an idea of what you can do. But just looking at it, you can say, well, in this pond there's no fish in there, but in this pond there's a high density of fish in there. And what's the difference? Well, the difference by looking at it is one has a really open mouth, and therefore there's a lot more interaction of velocities and food transport probably into that kind of alcove pond feature, where another one's really closed off and there's no fish in it. And it's like, hey, that's good information to the design team. Let's open these alcoves up at the mouth and get a more interaction of flows. And well, this alcove has more fish than this one, and what's the difference? Well, this one has a hyporheic connection. It actually has flow coming in at the top, and the other one is really long and skinny and has no flow coming in at the top, and therefore like very little food transport. And Chinook like to be close to adjacent velocities. They don't have to be in the fast stuff, but they like being nearer that stuff. Whereas coho, you might see a coho at the very back of an alcove that has no flow coming into it, but I would never see too many Chinook once they get a little larger back there. So that's just an example of what we're trying to move towards, and because we're getting so complex with our designs about coming up with an evaluation of looking at the fish density. So we've been doing this habitat mapping at the rehab sites since 2008, and it's really important to get that pre and post, but we want to go back to them. We're being strategic about, hey, we saw a change at this site a few years after construction, and now is a good time to go back and let's keep that story going and see what's happened there. And I'm going to give an example of that. And so our method is quick. We've shown it's reproducible, and we're able to cover a lot of ground. And it's been really important to track this progress through time. The habitat availability is the #1 prioritized assessment or rearing habitat on the Trinity, and it's definitely one of the good stories of what we're doing out there. So I'm going to give one example of a pre and a post-construction or as-built and a site evolved through time on the opportunity, and it's called the Upper Dark Gulch site. It's about 6 miles downstream of the dam. So in 2008, this is what that section of channel looked like. It was your pretty typical Trinity. We had riparian encroachment. This would be your floodplain, but it's basically disconnected. It takes pretty high flows for water to get up here, and we got our heavy riparian bank and really pretty much a straight channel and not a lot of complexity here. So the design for this site included, the #1 goal, like all of them, is to increase rearing habitat. So I'm on a rearing habitat at a range of flows, which is something an important aspect to remember about our mapping is it's a snapshot at time at that specific flow we go and map. a model can tell you a range of flows of how much habitat, and it's estimating it. Well, we're out there measuring it, but it's only at the flows that we measure it at. And if it's twice the flows than what we were at, it's a different habitat, and our maps don't speak to that. But we really zone in on our critical rearing period is in the winter, and we typically have really low base flows. We're hoping to change that someday, but right now we can't manipulate flows until after April. And so we focus our, if there's only one flow we're going to do, it's that winter base flow during that critical rearing period of January to May that most of the fish are experiencing. So at this site we have berm removal, we did floodplain lowering, we have a side channel that was created. This was like year 2 of starting to add wood and getting a little bit better about adding wood on the project, and it was a kind of a modest amount of excavation, 24,000 cubic yards for this site. And that floodplain was constructed to be inundated at around 4,500 CFS. It was going to start getting wet at around 4,500 CFS. So we did our pre and post construction mapping in 2008 and 2009 right after the bulldozers left. And for this site and many of them, we mapped them at 5 flows. And we know the rearing habitat or the dip that there's this dip in the flow to rearing habitat curves that we're aware of on the Trinity, and it's that lower range of flows. Once we get up to 3, 4, 5,000 CFS, there's a lot of water spreading out everywhere, and we know that's really good for the fish. So when we have a chance or when we can, we zone in on this 300 CFS. That's winter base flow from the dam up to 2,000 CFS, and we specifically request benches during our spring hydrograph that allow us to go out there and map during these steady flow states for like 3 or 4 days. There are crews out there right now mapping at 700 at some sites. So, and then we revisited the site in 2013 after the 2011 high flow event. We saw things had changed, and we're like, hey, maybe there's a cool story to tell. It's time to go back to Upper Dark Gulch. And so then I'm going to show you some of the results of the optimal and total habitat that we've seen at this site. And this is just a picture. You can see this. Here's our GPS and our rangefinder, and the guys out there measuring. And dude here's got the tablet, and that's where the points are all coming up. And we do lots of different levels of QC as we're going, and everything is attributed in different ways as we take the points. So, pre versus post construction at Upper Douglas City. Optimal habitat, that's the high quality habitat. We had increase in habitat at the low range, 300 to 700 CFS. You can still see it's dipping down, but it's higher. We have more. That's good. But when we get to 2,000 CFS, we have less optimal habitat than we did pre-construction. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying. Well, we remove all the vegetation and added some amount of wood back, but it's not making up for it yet. And at total habitat, we had increases in habitat at all flows that we mapped, but we're still seeing this little dip. And in an optimal world, at every flow, as flows increases, we'd see that graph going up. And we've only seen that in a few places so far at our restoration sites. So here's what the maps look like. Pre-construction is on the left, post-construction is on the right, and this is 2,000 CFS, so the highest flow we mapped. And you can see you might be able to see the polygons pre-construction. They're really tiny and skinny and tied to the bank, and that's very typical of the problem we have on the Trinity with the 30 years of low flows. It was 150 CFS from 65 to the 80s, and that allowed the riparian vegetation to grow up, and we never had a high flow event. We would have had even on a dry year this year, we would have had 2 40,000 CFS events. And those can knock some trees around and inundate floodplains, but for 30 years we had 150 CFS on the Trinity. So post-construction, you can now see our side channel. So now we got 4 edges across the valley instead of 2, and you can see water kind of starting to flood across from the side channel back to the main stem because of some lowering that we did. And you can see little patches of where the wood was added in the side channel. All right, well that's good. We like to know what happened after the bulldozers leave, but how is it changing through time? And hopefully it's going in the right direction. We want it to evolve, and we want it to get better and not go back towards where it was. So here's our high flow stream event at this site. The entire place was inundated. it was a good time those few days on the river, and it was exciting. You knew there was things happening on the river in a lot of places. So here's our post-high flow. It's the same two lines we saw before, but our y-axis has changed because the revisit we are seeing, we still have about the same amount of habitat at low flow, but as flows increase, we're seeing huge increases in not just the total habitat, but now we're seeing huge increases in optimal habitat too. And this was pretty exciting for us, and this is kind of like, well, that's exactly what we were hoping to see. You know, we saw increases after the bulldozers, but now our flows hit it. Some processes happening there, and now we're seeing increases of habitat and at a range of flows. So what happened? Well, the big thing that happened at this site is there was a huge amount of gravel deposited in the main stem. We lowered the whole cross section of valley, and that allowed for gravel to deposit there, and so for the channel to readjust. And this right here, this bit of willows right here is these bit of willows right here, and this whole bar all the way down was deposited in that one flow event. And from our topographic differencing, we figure it's roughly around 7,000 cubic yards of a gravel bar deposited there. So, and here's how you can see the red line, the lower line is the post-construction channel, and the 2013 is this blue channel or blue line. And so we effectively filled in almost half of the main stem. Here's our 7 feet of deposition of a bar right here. Here's the side channel, but the floodplain is the same elevation. So if you take 2,000 CFS now and try to fit it in this channel, well, it's not fitting in this channel so well. And what's that doing? But that's pushing water out onto the floodplain at a lower flows, and that's exactly what we'd like to see. We know how valuable floodplain habitat is, and we're lacking that on the Trinity, have been. So the other part of the story, we now know, okay, we got water moving out onto this floodplain. Here's what it looked immediately after construction, pretty barren in 2009. And there's the 2013 conditions, and that's mostly all natural revegetation we're seeing there. There's definitely, we do a lot of planting at our sites, but what we're looking at here is mostly natural revegetation of grasses and young willows. And you can just imagine when the water inundates all that, we have some pretty nice habitat. So we saw this slide earlier, the 2,000 CFS post-construction map, and now this is the same flow. And this black line is the wetted edge. So now we have water all the way to the hill slope, or it's the tailings, mine tailings slope. But we have water across this whole floodplain at 2,000 CFS, and giant, huge polygons of blue of optimal habitat, as well as wetted places. And so where it was constructed to be inundated at 4,500, we're now getting water. It's across the entire thing at 2,000 CFS, and we mapped water on the floodplain all the way down to 700 CFS. So a really big change of processes happening thanks to our flows and the combination of construction. So we got a really great team. There's been a lot of different people working on it for the years. We cooperate. I'm with the Yurok tribe. We cooperate with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Hoopa tribe on this, and as well as the restoration program staff. And this is the reference to our manuscript that I could share with others or people if they would like it, of the methods and the validation of our mapping. That's all, and I guess we're holding questions till after.
Thanks, Aaron. So our final speaker this morning is Rocco Fiore. He's an engineering geologist with 25 years of experience in the areas of ecosystem science, engineering, heavy equipment operation, and construction management. He is licensed in California as a professional geologist and timber operator. His experiences include the application of geoformology, hydrogeology, and engineering to assess, design, and restore ecosystem function for salmonids and their communities. In 2010, he was recognized for his innovative stream and floodplain restoration techniques by the Salmonid Restoration Federation. Over the past 17 years, Mr. Fiore has been involved in assessment, design, implementation of large and small-scale restoration projects in the Klamath, Trinity, Scott, Smith, South Fork Eel and Matole rivers and tributaries of the North Coastal California. Please welcome Rocco.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Lance. So let's see if I can get this going. Yeah, so the title of my talk is Restoration of Complex Habitat Assemblies in Sediment-Rich Ecosystems, Examples from the Lower Klamath Tributaries. And so what I mean by sediment-rich is the watersheds that I primarily work in the Lower Klamath produce up to 2 orders of magnitude of sediment per unit area as what the Trinity program uses as gravel augmentation for their river. And so when I put wood in the stream, we see an immediate response. And I was just talking with DJ and Aaron last night over this presentation that what I get accomplished through adding wood and the combination of flow and sediment in 1 year, they're excited if they see it in 10. So discussion topics, I'm going to focus on how we're integrating the knowledge and application of large wood loading and off-channel habitat construction that we've learned in small systems and in large systems like the Trinity, but focusing on what we're doing in 2nd to 5th order streams in the Lower Klamath. And so we use a combination of bank-based jams, bar apex jams, stumps, and off-channel features. We target the location of these types of installations at biological hotspots such as tributary confluences, pre-existing side channels and wetlands, springs, and where we can promote beaver activity. Our long-term approach is to continue adding wood into our constructed landscape until we see natural recruitment maintain the processes that occur with the wood loading that we accomplish during the construction phase. So it's a long-term commitment. So part of the guiding concepts that have led to the approach that we're using came from a study that Joelle Benninger did for her master's thesis on the East Fork of Mill Creek, which is in state park property on the Smith. And at that, in that study, we mapped facies changes and the effects of wood loading at 9 sites. And so this is an example of one of those sites. So prior to the wood loading, we had a very homogeneous plain bed condition. The gravel was pretty much, D50 was 64 millimeters throughout the reach. And after one winter flow, following the addition of wood, you can see that the facies composition really changed tremendously. And when we get into the vertical changes, this line represents where the thalweg was, and then after the addition of wood, we promote a very deep scour hole with cover in the presence of wood. And then in the cross-section changes, similar to what Aaron was saying, upstream of the jam we see aggradation in the channel that pushes water up onto the floodplain. It stores spawning gravel. At the site we see scour, and then downstream the interaction of the hydraulics that leave the feature and engage with subsequent downstream changes that we make, we see additional aggradation. So overall, putting wood in the system has increased floodplain connectivity. So these slides here show kind of a summary of what we found at the 9 sites. Anchoring the ordinate here are 2 control structures that are just single logs ballasted with large boulders, and then all the points raising up from there are constructed complex wood. The story just repeats itself. The more wood you add, the more cover you get, the more residual pool depth or scour. The more wood you add, the more habitat heterogeneity or facies heterogeneity, and similarly, the more wood you add, the more channel stored gravel. So we take those principles in combination with other work. These 2 graphs were prepared by Roney from work that Montgomery and Abbey did in the Queets. And the graph here on the left shows that wood that is longer than bankful width, the relative length and relative diameter which is the diameter of the wood to the bankful depth. Basically, once you start getting over 0.5 in each metric, you get increased stability. Another way I look at this graph here is that it takes the large pieces of wood to hold the medium-sized pieces of wood, and the medium-sized wood to hold the loose wood, and it's the loose wood that holds the fish. The graph on the right shows different wood jam types and the different watershed domains where they're commonly occurring. And so in the watersheds where I work, we have a whole host of different types of log jams that operate, and so that's what I'll be presenting, is just how they interact and how we utilize them to change. And then another important concept is what Aaron was talking about earlier, and DJ, using hyporheic exchange mechanisms to improve spawning, to increase flow into the floodplain for water storage that recharges and comes back as base flow. And this example here on the right from Ward et al. Shows that when you change the hydraulic conductivity within the stream bed, you can affect the flow lines to either go up or down. And essentially these blocks mimic what a large log jam would do. So if you have a stream that has water temperature problems, adding a series of large log jams that induce hyporheic exchange into the groundwater will potentially increase or decrease your temperature downstream through that exchange. So the project locations that I'm going to show you today are in the Lower Klamath, Hunter Creek, Turwer, and McGarvey, and so I'll first focus in Hunter Creek. We started top-down approach, working in the upper watershed back in 2013, and worked our way through. Actually, we started in a small tributary in 2011 and got landowner buy-in to the approach, and then got into the main stem and worked our way through. And so we've completed 7 sites. The watershed has homes and 3 bridges. All of our wood, which I didn't give the disclaimer that we add, is unanchored. It's naturally ballast with naturally occurring alluvium, and we use hydraulic forces and posts, or some people might call them piles, as our restraining elements. So we, like I've been mentioning, we put the key structures in as an element to amplify either an alcove that is pre-existing or a side channel that we are constructing, or both. The other concept here that's really important is we're trying to get enough speed bumps built back into the watershed such that at some future point we can do wood addition similar to doing gravel addition downstream of a dam. So walking downstream through the Hunter Creek watershed, here's Site 1, pre-construction. You can see it's pretty much just a boulder channel bed. There's a naturally forming bar apex jam on this forested island that we enhanced, and part of the purpose of the enhancement was to engage the side channel here on the right at lower and more frequent flows, but also to help induce changes in the bed topography. The bar apex jam works in combination with these woven jams on the right bank. Again, there's no anchorage, there's no cable, there's no bolting to the riparian trees. They're just woven in, and what helps maintain the wood in place is just the flow field hitting the log and locking it up against the riparian tree. So you can see after this is now looking upstream at that same site, within a year's time, we've completely changed the facies composition of the channel bed. We've got spawning adjacent to cover habitat, adjacent to rearing habitat, and we're inducing flows into the side channel that provides connectivity overall. And then at high flow, everything's good, like Aaron likes to say, the fish are partying in the bushes at that time. Another important concept with the unanchored wood, these bank-based jams, is because they're not cabled in a static condition, they can rise and fall like a sluice gate weir, essentially, with the changes in the stage of the stream. At high stage, like shown in this bottom photo, the wood rises up in the water column and it catches drifting material. And then at the lower stage, it sets back down onto the bed of the stream and puts the wood habitat where the fish are. The other important hydraulic aspect of that mobile wood, or the wood being able to rise and fall in the water column, is that when it acts as a sluice gate weir, it's forcing the flow into the bed, and you get a much better scour hole developing than if the wood was just fixed in one position. So moving further downstream, kind of preconditions, just a plain bed channel, very homogeneous, very unfriendly to fish. We call these bowling alleys or jeep roads, but this is actually the creek bed, and it goes subsurface during the later time of the summer. So we add a bar apex jam near a tributary confluence, and immediately we get a deep scour hole on the right bank, a high flow side channel on the left bank, and we're starting to rack drifting material. Here it is a couple years later after a 5-year flood event, and we've racked a similar amount of wood that we use to build the structure, plus are storing a large amount of gravel upstream, which ultimately meters out and provides more bed complexity and resupply of gravel, but it slows it down so we're not burying or inundating the spawning that is going on downstream. So here's a view of it from the side. There's that unit bar that is formed on the upstream side of the bar apex jam. Here we've got steelhead reds at the pool tail out that prior to the construction of this jam, the hydraulics would have been present, the upwelling and the different depths and velocities would not have been present. Completely changed the habitat conditions at the site with the addition of one log jam. Moving further downstream, Site 7, this just really illustrates you build a complex engineered log jam, you rack a similar amount of wood, and essentially in one flow season, the racking of the volume of wood that it takes to build these things, the jam has paid for itself in terms of wood. So just around the corner, this is a combination structure where I've built a bar apex jam to split the flow and attached it to a bank-based jam that is supported by these vertical posts and have spanning wood across this channel to produce a deep scour hole here. So looking at it at a different view and at different flows, you can see we've got very complex hydraulics. We've got a wake zone that will eventually develop a floodplain island behind it. I targeted this location because there was already willow trying to form that kind of feature, and the placing of this wood will just accelerate that process. So again, we've got the bank-based jam over here, we've got spanning logs, and what we see when we get those spanning structures are very deep scour holes forming with cover. Moving downstream through Site 7, here you can see an assembly of several jams that work together to change the hydraulics, store sediment, and provide habitat. So bar apex jam 3, I call it the chaos jam. It's storing a tremendous amount of gravel upstream after this winter, yet the next downstream jams, we've got deep scour holes. So that this jam is going to meter sediment through this reach over time, but under current condition, it provided some cover for those structures downstream not to get inundated by sediment. So here's just a couple of quick shots. The chaos jam was, there was some wood stranding in that location, and what we did is we just set that wood aside. We built a larger structure, and here's the as-built condition, and then with the first flows, and then at a 5-year flood, the jam is creating a hydraulic jump that is about 4 feet above the average floodplain water surface. This spanning log that was placed as part of the jam design also helps guide water onto the floodplain and into a wall-based channel that runs the length of the project route. So you can kind of see the scale of the hydraulic jump in the face of this jam by the person standing here. She's about 5.5 feet tall, and the hydraulic jump is half her height right there. So, and then here's the same site at a lower 1.5 year, 1.25 year recurrence flood. So moving further downstream, here's bank-based jam, just part of the overall complexity that we're adding in. Bar roughness jams, I've been experimenting with just putting coal wood that it isn't great enough to go into a bar apex jam, to try and induce bar formation and to rack driftwood and drifting wood through the water column. And these are very low-cost structures. They take, you know, just a couple hours to build, and the wood that you're using is can be gained from slash piles, basically. So here's bar apex jam 4, 5, and 6. 6 is further downstream. It's out, just barely out of the picture, but we'll take a closer look at that in a second. So the purpose of 4 and 5 was to create a point bar feature. We anticipated getting some bank erosion here, and we did, and we now have a nice bar formed, and we're starting to develop floodplain wetlands in between bar apex jam 4 and 5. And so placing these things in close proximity of each other can, you know, be a tool to create floodplains, not only pool habitat. So here's bar apex jam 6, split flow jam, side channel that was constructed, and so the purpose of this structure was to induce flow into the side channel at more frequent flows. And that's its function. That's what it was successfully able to do this last winter. And again, here we have another structure that racked naturally occurring mobile wood, and we've doubled the volume of wood in this location through the presence of structure, a side view of the structure, and the crescent-shaped pool that's connected underneath the overhanging debris, woody debris, that's connected to the main stem. And at most flows, this side channel reconnects further downstream at the next site that I'll show you here. So we're trying to develop low-cost wood installation techniques, and so this is a post-assisted debris rack is what I call it. And we're looking at utilizing these in other locations. Lagunitas Creek is one location that we're thinking about doing it. We're also looking at using them as a beaver analog type dam on steroids, because the posts that we're using are embedded at a much greater depth, and the wood that is woven into it should be able to handle higher sediment transport rates. So here's kind of a look into the guts of it. There's these embedded posts that have a gap in between them, and then there's horizontal logs placed in the trench starting at about 9 feet below grade, and then building up to just about 6 feet below grade. Then we put willow in to grade, and we add in slash, and then backfill it. And this is what it looks like after a 5-year flow event. So this large piece of redwood here was naturally recruited. You don't see any deflection of the posts, and we developed a 5-foot deep scour hole here, and we scoured a tremendous amount of gravel and created a lot more complexity than was there previously. You know, let me just so I can show you. That's pre-construction conditions of the same location. So basically, that bowling alley channel condition we change into something much more complex. Here's some more shots from the side. So we place these debris racks in a series on the outside of a bend that had an eroding bank, and so now we've got all this slow water that provides good rearing habitat, and eventually what we expect to see here is deposition of fine sediment, and we'll just grow that bank back out that will have sediment that will grow trees much better than the gravel that's been currently depositing in the area. All right, so moving into a larger system, Turwer Creek. This is a 5th order watershed. The project area is just about 1.5 miles upstream from the Klamath River, at a 1.5-year flow event on the Klamath, we'll get backwater up to the 169 bridge. At a 5-year flow event, we'll get backwater from the Klamath up into the project reach. And at a year flow event, this surface here will be 25 feet underwater. So we're working in a very dynamic system. Essentially what's happening is when we have asymmetric flow with turwar producing sediment and Klamath backwater absent, it will transport the sediment out. But when the flow on the Klamath is up and the flow in the Trinity is up, we'll see these deltas form in channel, and that causes a lot of channel instability. So over time, since the 64 flood event, this bar has formed, and let me go back, sorry. This bar has formed, and we've seen an average of 25 feet of lateral migration into these Holocene soils, which in our mind is much more valuable than the gravel. So here's a couple of shots of before conditions where the gravel is eroding into the bank. We're replacing the Holocene soils with gravel. Here's a shot looking upstream, and I'll show you this slide again in comparison to some of the changes. So here we have the application of engineered log jams that help hydraulically connect the alcoves, and a type of bioengineering where we're using riparian engineering to direct flow to inundate side channels and work complementary with the bar apex jams by increasing flow. So the term bioengineering in our application isn't to stabilize the bank, but it's to generate desirable hydraulic outcomes. So here's an example of changes at ELJ1 over time. This is Asbuilt. Here it is 2 years after post-construction, and then 5 years after construction. And what you see is here's the post that is this same post right here. The channel is subsequently moved away after it, for a couple of years, provided really good scour and pool habitat with cover. Now we've got a forested island evolving. And due to the fact that we didn't pile in a bunch of riprap and cable, this thing will, over time, degrade as a compost, natural compost, to promote that forest island concept, and will then provide wood for recruitment and shade and all the other functions that we're looking at. Just a couple more quick slides looking downstream at ELJ, forcing flow over the longitudinal bar and how that connects with a side channel. And then here's kind of a pre-construction shot looking upstream at that same bank. And if you were out there now, what you would see is leaves. Basically the riparian zone has overtaken the banks and veg, and I'll try to illustrate that. Here's that same bank now, looking at it to the south, and then there's the bank looking back in that opposite direction. So we've completely transformed the riparian and the aquatic habitat through the addition of wood and proper grading. So I'm going to hurry up through these slides here, just a couple examples of alcoves in McGarvey, so I can then talk about what our monitoring is telling us. So we've constructed several off-channel habitat features. They're primarily blind alcoves, which they are connected through hyporheic flow, but not direct flow into the upper end. The Panther Pond is a natural analog. It's a natural feature, and so our fish densities at Panther are some of the highest that we see. McGarvey, all the features to the right here from Hunter over are constructed habitats. And based on literature and work that Nicholson has done, we're not saturating our off-channel habitat. And so this provides us a metric that we can look at to see if we're having success. And here I'm showing an example of that using a combination of data from British Columbia that Stephen Swales had participation in collecting with Slaney, and then data from the Yurok tribe. So this is a one-to-one line that basically says that if the habitat is saturated, it's going to be above the one-to-one line. If it's below, it's not saturated, according to Nicholson's suggestion. And so we'll be monitoring over time to see that change occur. And then building off of a recent publication by Ogston and Roney, I took our data, our wetted habitat, our abundance data and density, and came up with a cost per fish. And so what we're seeing with our off-channel habitat is if we amortize the average number of fish that are using these features over a 30-year period, the costs range from $16 per fish to $100 per fish. And what we need is more data to narrow these costs down and get a better estimate. As you can see in the brackets here, the number of years that these features have been in play. And what we are seeing is that the first year that structures are built, there's a high use. And then over time, the use declines. But there's also a difference in habitat type and habitat quality, as Aaron was saying. And, you know, for example, the turwar alcoves, they are highly dependent on a normal or wetter than normal water year type to be functional, whereas in McGarvey Creek, the groundwater table is high enough that it supports the alcove features even during a drier water year type. So the features that are experiencing the drought have a higher cost, but overall they still provide a valuable refuge for the fish. So then looking at real quick the wood loading costs, paper by Jen Cara and her colleagues working in Mendocino County. They compared their costs for installing unanchored wood to the local costs for installing anchored wood. And what we're seeing is our costs for unanchored wood and bar apex jams, if you would consider that unanchored wood, is very comparable to what Jen's costs are. So really what this slide tells me is we get a bigger bang for our buck by building bar apex jams and installing mobile wood than we do by building higher cost anchored wood structures. So our next steps, we have a very willing landowner. They're going to let us start moving floodplain roads up onto the valley sidewall so we can start to engage the entire valley floor. And what we're looking at doing is working at the downstream end of the perennial flow zone where flow goes subsurface in the summer, and encouraging beaver through the application of the post-assisted debris racks and log jams to increase the groundwater storage and hopefully promote a longer duration of surface flow. So that's it, and I think we can take questions.
Okay, so if you're in the room and you have questions, raise your hand and I'll bring around the microphone, and that's so that the people online can hear your question. And if you're watching online, you can type your question into the chat bar and we will read your question.
A question for Aaron. Is all your habitat restoration work in the Trinity focused on the main stem, or are you working on the tribs as well?
Thus far, everything we're doing on the Trinity is main stem, and that's the focus of the restoration program. There's some modest amount of money being spent on tributaries, and we're all recognizing we're kind of on the downslope part of the main stem focus, and we certainly have tributaries on the horizon and know that it's all one big part of the story, and that's coming soon, hopefully.
Hey guys, so I was wondering, you talked about those bank-based jams, I think, is that what you called them? Are those connected to anything in any way? You talked about them rising and falling, and they don't look like they have a lot of buoyant force.
Yeah, I call them bank-based jams or woven jams, and they're woven into standing riparian trees. And in some locations, if we don't have the optimal location of a riparian tree for the weave, we'll put in the posts to help support them. So there's no anchorage that holds them or prevents them from moving vertically, just prevents them from moving horizontally out of the project location. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not exactly sure how that works.
I'll explain it to you later, too.
Okay.
Lots of questions. I'll start with just one real quick. Aaron, you were talking about as far as moving the gravels. You guys were talking about moving, both of you guys were, but you were talking about moving the gravels to level out some of the inside bends and stuff. Where did you put the fill? Did you remove it from site and then they backfilled again? Is that what you were saying?
Well, yeah, anytime we're doing excavation, it's all out of the high flow channel. It all has to be placed out of the 100-year flood channel. Okay.
And Rocco, you're creating a bunch of features in areas where it looked like it was pretty dry. What steps are you taking to prevent developing ecological traps of sorts, or sinks, if you like to call them that?
Yeah, stranding is another way to describe what you're talking about, and I want to provide clarity first to a question you were asking Aaron in terms of the deposition. That was all natural, if that wasn't clear to you, that once the excavation occurred, the changes of deposition are through sediment transport processes engaging the design.
No, that part was clear.
Yeah, okay. And then, yeah, we are working in an area where the groundwater table during the summer will be anywhere from 20 to 45 feet below the channel bed surface. And so we know that there's going to be stranding for fish during that time. It's inevitable. What we see, though, is that by placing these structures in those areas where you have a losing stream condition and we're scouring deeper pools, that actually provides them a refuge area to get into a pool habitat when the rest of the channel at that time could go dry. Like in February, we have what we call the February fake out, or a midwinter drought, and that typically strands hundreds of fish, both adults and juvenile fish. And we see a high amount of predation on those fish that are in pools without cover. So to not employ log jam structures for fear of stranding during the summer isn't as much of a concern to us as employing them so that provides cover during the winter. It's a aspect, and that the stranding is going to reduce the population anyway.
So doesn't the stranding just happen during the wintertime then, since you're creating areas for the fish to focus?
Correct, but you know, as you saw in some of the slides, if you have a plain bed channel with no pools and the flow goes, it's a losing stream reach, and the flow goes subsurface, the fish are stranded on that flat surface. Whereas when we put a log jam there and it forms a pool, that pool has access to groundwater over a longer duration, with the chance of return rainfall reconnecting flow, so the adults or juvenile fish can move either upstream or downstream wherever they need to go.
Okay. There's more I could go on that, but I just want to ask one last question of you.
Yeah, we've had this conversation a fair amount on stranding, and you know, my basic take on it is if you're doing things to improve conditions for the overall population and the population numbers are increasing, yet you're having some stranding effect that is a negative effect, but overall you're having a beneficial effect, you have to accept some of the negative in order to get the positive.
I get that. Just a last comment for you. As you talked about promoting beaver work in those lower reaches where the water table drops. You said 45 feet?
Correct.
How exactly would beaver be able to enhance the water table in that aspect?
So it's not uniformly 45 feet below ground surface. The areas that we would target is where bedrock depths control the depth of groundwater, and the idea is that through the winter, if you're increasing the frequency of overbank flows, you're recharging the valley aquifer into those finer grained soils that have a lower hydraulic conductivity, and as the water table drops, the water seeps from those storage elements and recharges the higher conductivity soil, or gravels, which is your stream bed. And the idea is that if you can do that immediately downstream of where flow goes subsurface, you might be able to promote a longer duration of surface flow in that location. And if that proves successful, you do it again further downstream, and you do it again subsequently further downstream until eventually you may rebuild the entire aquifer system and have a longer reach of wetted flow.
This is a question for Aaron and DJ, but when you're coming up with those really specific quantitative objectives and then monitoring metrics based on those objectives, I know you said you're in a data-rich system, but were there ever situations where you weren't sure how much was enough in terms of habitat to be created, or what the optimal amount was, and yet you had to set these really specific objectives?
Just had to ask the question. Yeah, we're still struggling with how much is enough, and there's a lot that comes into it. We're affecting 40 miles of river, but there's however many miles of tributaries as well. There's the whole downstream part of the restoration reach. There's the unending argument of how many fish are we talking about, and agreeing on that. And so we're still struggling with how much is enough. We're quite sure we're not anywhere near there yet. And we've got things like a very important thing coming online, or that we're working on hard right now, is a fish production model to help us, inform kind of how close can we get with what we're doing. Are we on the right trajectory? Do we really need to think outside the present box, and those kinds of things. Yeah.
Any additional questions? Margaret, do we want to look to see what's, how do we get these?
I checked. We don't have any questions online.
Okay. I'll remind anybody that wants to attend, we'll have a roundtable discussion. The information's here on this slide. If you have any more lingering questions or want to get specifically into project specific and anything else, we have a roundtable discussion at 12:30, about 3 or 4 blocks south of here. So why don't you give a round of applause to our speaker, and thank you guys.